can see we're just about the top of the hour by my watch. I know numbers are still coming in, but we will make a start. And good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us, and welcome to the second installment in Dentons AI trilogy of webinars following the launch of our AI guide and survey earlier this year. My name is Simon Elliott. I'm a partner based in the Dentons office in London, focusing on data, cyber and technology regulation, and I'm absolutely delighted that you're able to join us for today's session. A few weeks ago, we held our first installment where we focused on the issues of trust and ethics in AI, and we were joined by fantastic technologist Pablo Beniti, as well as the rapporteur for the AI Act, the European AI Act, Brando Bonifi. For those that weren't able to join us in that session, a video for the session was recorded and is available on our website, so you should be able to find it on our AI Hub. Please feel free to do that at your leisure. In this, the second session, we are going to look to move the conversation on a little bit and move into look a little bit more detail in terms of the areas of regulation and legislation that's developing around AI, but also particularly how to manage these developments through the development of an AI strategy. We also have the third of our trilogies coming up in a few weeks' time, and where we'll start to take a further deep look at other measures for preparedness and adoption of those legislations. More detail of that to come a little bit in the session. So let me move on to make introductions to my co-host and other panelists for today. I'm delighted that my colleague, Dr. Kwan Hon, will be co-hosting and moderating for me today. Kwan is a member of our data and technology team with me in London, with a particular specialism in AI and other technology regulations. However, perhaps more importantly, let me introduce our fantastic panel. Firstly, let me introduce Andrea Renda. Andrea is Senior Research Fellow and Head of Global Governance, Regulation, Innovation and Digital Economy. That's quite a title, Andrea, but at the think tank Centre for European Policy Studies. Noteworthy, Andrea was a member of the European Commission high-level expert working group on AI and was one of the authors of a number of their outputs, including the guidelines for trustworthy AI published a number of years ago. Since that group finished its mission, Andrea has been supporting initially the European Commission in developing the AI Act, and more recently the European Parliament in assessing the AI Act. So we're absolutely delighted that Andrea was with us today and able to share his input, his insights. Secondly, let me introduce Shalini Kurapati. Apologies, Shalini, I was promising to get that right. Shalini is the Chief Executive Officer at Clearbox AI, and Clearbox is a company that focuses on supporting businesses with AI deployment, particularly through the use of synthetic data. And Shalini is a long-term advisor and practitioner in the AI space. And finally, but by no means least, let me introduce Naeem Sayed. Naeem is a Senior Legal Director in the Technology Procurement and IP team at the London Stock Exchange. And Naeem has been central to coordinating the legal and risk management approach that the group is adopting in relation to AI. So to all three of you, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're absolutely delighted that you're with us. A couple of quick housekeeping points before we get going. As usual, on Zoom, we have the QA feature at the bottom, which we'll use to collect any questions. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through the session. We will sort of try to address those at the end of the session. We do have some time allocated for the panelists to pick up those questions. And secondly, as you may have got a notice whenever you join the session is being recorded, and we will be publishing the session on our website. So please do be conscious of that in relation to any questions or any information that you disclose in any questions. Now, throughout the session, we have a couple of polls just to get a little bit of sense of where all of our audience is. So I'll just ask Brendan if he's able to start the first of the polls that we'll be looking at. And this in particular is just trying to get a sense of where organizations are in terms of their own development of a strategy, or where your business is in that. We have got some stats for ourselves from a survey that we've undertaken during the course of last year on this, but if you could please just go ahead and sort of complete how you sort of feel the current position around AI strategy best suits or best represents your current position. At the minute, we'll just give everyone another 5 seconds or so to complete that, and we'll just see generally where our audience might be. Okay, Brendan, if you're able to fire up our results on that. Not necessarily surprising, actually. I think the most striking sort of statistic there is that the bottom one, where the minority very much have actually gone through the process of adoption and authorization of it. Much more, biggest number, nothing in place, and a lot sort of the various stages of development elsewhere. Very interesting to see that, and very much, I think, consistent with the approach that we've been seeing or otherwise been hearing from clients in this space. Now, before we move on to the panel discussion, Kwan and I will just spend about 10 minutes or so just giving a bit of a brief overview in relation to where we are in terms of regulation in this space and some other thoughts. So if we can just move the next slide on, please. There we go. Now, what I wanted to do with this slide, and I've tried to with some of the sense of scale, was to give a bit of an indication about where the overall global position is in terms of regulation or other kind of guidance in relation to AI. Now, as you'll see on the kind of the left and middle of the slide, in terms of there is plenty of paper has been published in the context of AI. So, as I'm sure our panel do, but if anyone is interested or you know, wants to keep on top of all of the various things to do on this, there is no end of reading material that is available. As you'll see, the OECD is tracking something in the region of about 164 national strategies, national plans, national agendas. Other organizations are similarly tracking that at similar sort of numbers. There is obviously some variance, but again, very significant numbers in terms of those sort of national strategies. From an ethics and perspective and more principle-led approach, there are, again, a long list of publications that have been made. I've called out just a few that I think are kind of particularly noteworthy. We've already mentioned the EU high-level expert group already, and Andrea's involvement of that. And I also sort of wanted to flag the UNESCO Global Standards on Ethics, which I think is very interesting session as well, or a development initiative as well. So lots to be said on that. However, whenever you move to the right-hand side of the slide and actually get into where are we seeing some of the legislation and actual hard law, if I can refer to it in that way, develop, this is a much sort of smaller list that we're looking at. The European Draft AI Act is, widely recognised as the first piece of hard law that's sort of focusing specifically on regulation of the AI technology, and we'll go into, Kwan will speak in a little bit more detail about that in just a second. However, also just wanted to highlight some very recent developments in China, where I understand that just earlier this month, there has actually been taken effect some specific regulations that look at how algorithms operate under decision-making around algorithms. Some specific requirements coming out of that are look at specific prohibitions on price discrimination arising from the use of algorithmic decisions, as well as an ability for individuals to opt out of being targeted on the basis of algorithmic recommendation. So the kind of key message I think coming through this is that the tide is very much changing on this. We're expecting publication in pretty short order in the UK in relation to a consultation on governance and regulation of AI in this country. The noises around that are around increased reliance or certainly focus on assurance activity, but we'll need to see details of that. So very much a transition towards more regulation, but at this stage, and we'll come on to see, despite the fact that there is a lot of adoption of AI, very little in terms of hard law at the minute. But Kwan, I'll ask you to give a bit more of an overview in terms of some of those laws that are there.
Thanks very much, Simon. If we could move on to the next slide, please. So these are the key themes globally. And this list is an overview of the key issues that are consistent across the current guidance and regulatory proposals. And I'll just mention a couple. Accountability appears in nearly all the proposals. And of course, fairness and non-discrimination. The intention is to try and maximize fairness and promote inclusivity, perhaps in a way that even humans have not been able to. But none of these are going to be particularly surprising. Of course, another interesting point is throughout history, there is this theme of trying to regulate new technology or technology tools in their own right, as opposed to their uses, as we've seen with cloud computing previously. And this seems to be coming up on the AI regulation front as well. If we could move to the next slide, please. Now, on the AI Act, I'm going to quickly focus on a few points as we discuss the pros and cons of this later, or some of this later. And session 3 of this trilogy series is going to focus specifically on the AI regulation. So in terms of scope, this is a difficult issue as to what is an AI system that will be regulated under the AI Act. It's still being debated. Initially, the Commission proposal is probably too broad, but of course the concern often is it going to be too narrow? In terms of territorial application, it's quite broad. The focus is on where the impact of the AI system occurs. And in many ways, this is similar to GDPR. And one reason why the AI Act is being closely watched as a potential global benchmark. And there will be a 2-year transition period before it all comes in at the moment. This Act takes a risk-based approach to regulation. So some things are considered so risky that they're prohibited altogether. And then other AI uses might be considered high risk with some governance. And then you have other types of AI uses. Now, the banned practices, many of these are obvious. There is still a controversy about what should or should not be banned. And currently they include the ones listed on this slide, but some of them may be still more difficult to clearly identify at the outset, like exploiting vulnerabilities. How do you figure out whether you're exploiting vulnerabilities? The high-risk system governance, the focus is very much on how you do high-risk AI, as well as, of course, the questions about what should or should not be considered high risk. And in terms of what is high-risk AI, it is pretty broad, like use of AI in employment, biometrics, critical infrastructure, access to public services and education. But yeah, that's still up for debate as to what's considered high risk. In terms of the governance rules for high-risk AI, there are quite a few key obligations, and just picking out a couple of them, high-quality data sets. AI systems have to be trained, validated, and tested by high-quality data sets, which are relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. So how on earth do you manage to produce these high-quality data sets? The continuous risk management. It's a well-known concept for privacy by design and so on, but there are new risks that will have to be identified and assessed. In terms of transparency, including the characteristics, capabilities, and limitations of performance of the high-risk AI system, that's going to be broader in terms of what has to be, what transparency matters have to be included. In terms of human oversight, again, this is known from GDPR, can the system be effectively overseen by competent natural persons? How do you fully understand the capabilities and limitations of the high-risk AI system so that you can duly monitor its operations? And for lower risk AI, there is a focus on transparency for AI with a human interface like chatbots or deepfakes for certain AI uses. So there's going to be more about this discussed later. And then for lower risk types of AI, the intention is to have codes of conduct that address wider issues like sustainability, accessibility, diversity in design teams, but that's to come. And of course, just to flag that the penalties are potentially very, very high with the AI Act, even more than the GDPR, possibly up to 30 million euros and 6% turnover in terms of the maximum fines. Next slide, please. Now, it's not just the AI Act, of course, that's relevant to AI. The GDPR is also relevant, and I'm going to say a little bit about that, but I did want to emphasize that there are lots of other laws which are relevant to AI, like laws on equality and non-discrimination, competition law, etc. Obviously, there's no time to talk about this, and as flagged previously, the AI Act will be discussed in more detail in the next webinar. Now, in terms of GDPR issues, which are relevant to AI now, because of course the AI Act has not yet gone through, but we do have the GDPR now. Enforcement is an interesting area, and in terms of GDPR enforcement, which is related to AI. So far, there are two types. It's biometrics, so the use of facial recognition, fingerprints, voice prints, video and keyboard use, etc. And the second main type is automated decision-making, like with taxi company loyalty scheme and a lot of cases with rideshare or delivery drivers. The practical points, when you're talking about how you apply GDPR to AI, probably fairly obvious. The data protection impact assessment is the most important, and consulting prior consultation with the regulatory authority if required, and data protection by design and by default, and carrying out pilots, tests, making sure the projects are phased, considering the type of data, the team, training, stakeholders, etc., considering the use of synthetic data, which we're going to discuss more about later. And of course, the principles are pretty obvious as well from the GDPR perspective: lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, and different concepts of fairness, transparency and explainability, legal basis, particularly for special category data, purpose limitation, using data obtained for one purpose for AI training, data minimization and pseudonymization, security, data subject rights, and of course, suitable safeguards for automated decision-making, the use of vendors, because of course, a lot of AI services are from third parties, liability and other commercial issues there, as well as Article 28 data processing agreements, and continuous monitoring and iterations, of course, throughout. In terms of the impact of the AI Act on the GDPR obligations are largely unaffected. For example, the requirements regarding biometrics used for identification. There will be regulatory sandboxes where there are some relaxations, for example, regarding purpose limitation or possibly enforcement, according to the Council's latest draft. Question mark whether it goes far enough to allow the use of special category data for AI training purposes. At the moment, it's only for high-risk AI that this would be allowed where it's strictly necessary to reduce or eliminate bias, but might be not be useful or important to be able to process special category data to eliminate bias in other types of AI. The European Data Protection Board and European Data Protection Supervisor have commented on the Act. For example, they want to extend the bans on social scoring and real-time biometrics or the restrictions on them. They want to ban emotion recognition, clustering of people by biometrics into ethnicity, etc. And indeed, they want to regulate the AI Act, to be the regulators on the AI Act. So we'll see to what extent their comments are going to be taken into account. And finally, just to end with a progress update on the AI Act. As you know, the regulation is proposed by the European Commission, and then it has to be agreed by the European Parliament and the Council. In terms of the Council, the French presidency has issued various compromise texts quite quickly in succession, January, February, March, with more to come. So obviously they're trying to progress it. In terms of the Parliament, there's a joint committee which is looking at this. They had a hearing last week on the AI Act, and I won't say much else because Andrea is going to be discussing this later in the panel. But there has been a separate IDA report, yet another European Parliament committee last week, which interestingly did say the EU should not always regulate AI as a technology, but it has to be proportionate to the type of risk. So again, this approach about do you recognize the technology is not necessarily risky as such, but you are looking at the risk from its use. And now I think we are on to the next poll.
Thanks very much, Quan. Yeah, if you just skip on to the next slide, just before we bring up the poll, I just wanted to highlight one of the key findings that I think, from my perspective, sort of underlines a lot of the issues that Quan was identifying, and I think sort of then leads quite neatly into our discussions on strategy. But as I mentioned earlier, we carried out a survey towards the back end of last year and published that in January. And I think it's very sort of telling from these two statistics that if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, statistics, there's approximately 60% of organizations that we are in contact with are deploying AI in some way, either extensive use or in a pilot stage, whereas only 19% have a strategy in place, consistent with the poll that we had earlier, and another sort of 23% in progress, again, quite consistent picture. So this is or the very definition of what an issue where the market is leading the law. And I think that really underpins why developing a strategy to help organizations to deploying AI as we know that they are, while the goalposts on the legislative requirements are developing. Now, if we just bring up our second slide just before we move into our panel discussion, or sorry, our second poll, just to get again a sense of the audience's sort of issue, considerations around this. Brendan, I don't know if you're able to throw that up. Thank you. This is really sort of thinking about what are some of the other key issues, the key challenges that your organization is facing whenever actually deploying AI, sort of expertise, or some of these other common issues that come up in the discussion of AI. Again, we'll just give everyone just another second or so to respond to those. It's great, Brandon. Maybe if you can throw up the results and see where we get to. So quite a variety. So bias, data protection compliance, and lack of expertise sort of coming up regularly. So if you just move on to the next slide, then actually this is again relatively consistent with some findings that we were sort of coming up with in our survey. If we were to move that on, those that can see in the bottom right hand corner there, some other challenges that we found. So data protection considerations certainly high up there, as well as some cost implications. Well, we'll now move on to get our panel, or the views of our fantastic panelists. It's certainly enough from myself and Kwan. And I'm going to start the proceedings a little bit just by opening quite a simple question and to move with. So almost every sort of ethical framework or discussion that sort of comes up, it always sort of slightly challenged to define AI. And as Kwan was already mentioning, that's one of the challenges with the scope of the AI Act. And indeed, just recently, the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation published its first poll tracker or public survey tracker. And it found that while about 90% of individuals had heard of, or respondents had heard of AI, only about 50% or so, or in fact, about 60% or so, were able to actually explain AI in any sort of technical sort of way. So just to help our audience sort of frame things, I've just asked the panelists to come up with their favorite version of AI in the wild, if I can call it that. And maybe, Shalini, if it's okay, I can start with you.
Yeah, of course, Simon. AI in the wild sounds interesting. So probably I'll give an example of an AI that you might not expect it to be AI in the field of precision agriculture. So they use take all the sensor data, satellite imagery, and lots of farming information to help farmers to make decisions, optimize pesticides, optimize seed and fertilizer, reduce the environmental impact of farming, for example. And you wouldn't consider that AI.
Yeah. A lot of industrial applications beyond the sort of some of the more challenging issues that you can. Thank you for that. Andrea, how about you? What about you?
Well, Shalini was mentioning AI on field. I think the wildest example that I have in mind is AI trying to find its way on Twitter. And this is a 6-year-old example from Microsoft when they tried to develop a chatbot that would learn from the many highly deserving pieces of content that you can find on Twitter, in particular in the comment sections, right? And trying to develop its own personality by somehow mimicking the language of teenagers on Twitter, and ending up within a few hours saying things like Hitler was right, or 9/11 was an inside job, and then becoming fascist and racist, and until he had to be withdrawn. Meaning AI depends very much on data. Once it learns from the data that we produce very spectacularly, you can get very bad results.
Very interesting, and I know a topic we'll explore a little bit further in a bit more detail, but very interesting. Thank you, Andrea. And Naeem?
The ones that I find really interesting, but I haven't used them myself, but I've just been reading about them, are the sort of AI applications that are for lawyers that suggest that they can do predictive things around, the types of decisions, that might come up based on precedent, whether that's based on, for example, in the US, you've got a lot more data around judges' decisions, so you can sort of see, where a judge might lean on a certain precedent because they have traditionally lent on a particular precedent for their decision making, and that route makes a difference into, the probability of where they'll come out on a particular point. and also in terms of, you know, the ability to sort of use that for, you know, IP, trademark, patent sort of decision making, because again, it's based on precedent. So those things are quite interesting. I haven't seen, I don't know if you have, you know, how well they work, but they seem to be promising quite a lot, and they've sort of been, you know, developed by a combination of law firms and law faculties and some of the big universities.
Yeah, no, it is sort of the legal tech, really kind of fertile area for these sort of developments. And if you read sort of Jamie Suskins and others, you know, the world will be removed from lawyers shortly, which I'm sure will be to everyone's benefit. But Kwan, I'll sort of hand over to you to take us through a little bit more discussion on the regulation.
Thanks very much, Simon. So focusing on the AI regulation, the first question we've got for the panelists is, what's your view of the approach that's being adopted to risk management in the AI Act? In particular, do you think the approach of regulating based on risk rather than specific use cases or sector-specific assessments works for AI? Have the requirements articulated in the high-level, the Commission's high-level expert group guidelines for trustworthy AI actually been appropriately reflected in the EU AI Act? If I may come to you first, Andrea.
Yes, thank you very much, Kwan. I'll start from the last question, perhaps, because I was a member of the high-level expert group, and we developed principles for trustworthy AI that is to be intended as legally compliant, ethically aligned, and socio-technically robust AI. So we developed 4 principles of trustworthy AI, in particular looking at the ethical dimension, and then we converted them into 7 requirements, which were a sort of a first step towards developing regulatory requirements, if you wish. And now those requirements are now found in the AI Act with respect to those specific applications of AI that are considered to be a high risk. Not all of them, though, because there's at least one which would have been quite far-reaching, which would be a general obligation to ensure the orientation of AI applications towards societal and environmental well-being, which is currently not represented. Now, that said, the approach based on specific AI applications that are considered to be high risk is indeed a combination of an approach that is based on use cases and a risk-based approach, because indeed, the European Commission had initially thought about, let's identify sectors that might be more risky than others. Then they thought, let's identify use cases only. They ended up, as often happens when you look for compromise solutions, doing both. So they chose sectors, and within sectors, use cases or applications that are considered to be particularly risky. And for those only, which are estimated by the European Commission in a rather nebulous way at the moment to be corresponding to roughly 10% of the market or the future market for AI. For those high-risk applications, the AI Act triggers those regulatory requirements, which again mirror partially the approach that was adopted initially by the high-level expert group. So bottom line, the approach is risk-based, the approach is targeted at use cases, the approach is not aimed at regulating the technology itself, whether it's going to work, whether the risk classification will be correctly interpreted, if there is anything like a correct interpretation. I think the devil is in the details, and only time will tell in that respect.
Great, thank you very much. Naeem, can I come to you next for your views on these questions?
I'm not sure if there's a right way to do it, but I think it's interesting that they've taken so many elements in a sort of GDPR approach, and is the sort of processing of data across all industries the same as the use of AI across all industries? I'm not sure. I think there is every industry that's going to say, you know, what about, you know, all the nuances and complexities and other, you know, considerations that need to come in. So what if you take 2 very kind of 3 different scenarios? One, we talked about the legal sector, it's professionally regulated. There is an obligation on, you know, practitioners to be able to sort of understand technology and then still be responsible for, you know, the advice that's given. I think in a financial services scenario, you also have, obviously huge implications in terms of, a product, ultimately creating, errors in, large capital volumes. And then you have something that has a direct health and security kind of implication. So I think, I wonder how each industry will then take the, this broad, act and then say, do we need each of the professional bodies for each of those industries to then say, okay, let me put an extra layer on that, and to what extent does that need to carve things out, add things to it, and then you ultimately have something where you are a lawyer in the financial service industry, but also it has a direct physical kind of manifestation, and therefore it has a health and safety aspect to it. So then you have what I think is known as a clash of laws. So I think you have then, that to kind of unwind. So I'd love to see how the implementation of it and what good sort of secondary support documentation will, allow us to sort of see how do you essentially unravel that potential clash of laws, and be able to sort of, help people, because ultimately, the point will be that, the law is, clear to apply. So I think it's just really that tension between, how will people in practice, take this overarching, act and kind of apply it to their context. Because, sorry, just to finish, then you have, let's say, a use case where you're trying to, look at someone's eligibility, either for credit or for employment. And then you also have, the laws that sort of apply there. So I think it's just really seeing how that will work in practice. But, again, bottom line, is it better than having no law? Yes. Is it better than having, each of these different bodies try to create their own AI extensions of their own frameworks? Probably, because you will probably have somebody race ahead, and then others sort of come later, and then you have this kind of, again, you have this kind of not mess, but you would have, a real, kind of soup of law that you'd have to kind of wade through to kind of figure it out. So I guess law is good. And experience will kind of help us, I think, because I think even now GDPR is well established, and maybe it was complicated at the beginning.
Thanks very much, Naeem. Can I turn to you next, Shalini, and ask you, what about the approach the AI Act takes to data and data governance when it's used for AI model training? And in particular, the need for the data sets to be high quality or relevant, representative, free of errors, complete. Does that reflect how data is used in AI model training? What role does synthetic data have to play in that?
Thank you. One, I'll try to, cut those questions and try to answer in a way that's probably coherent. So let's start with, we were talking about risk-based AI so far, right? So the regulation is looking at the risk-based AI aspects. So where do these risks come from is a question we need to ask. So as I am a practitioner, so we know that when we build AI models, 80% of our time is spent on data, right from acquisition, transformation, storage, cleaning, and before it even enters the, and we call it a pipeline actually, because we see data as fuel to AI. So data is very much part of the regulation. I mean, what I think one important difference, we were talking about the overlap with GDPR and the current one, GDPR focuses entirely on data protection, doesn't care about utility of this data. So for machine learning models or AI models, you need high quality data. Otherwise, we call it garbage in, garbage out. So what do I mean by high quality data? So right from the beginning, the so-called pipeline that fuels the machine learning models, you need to have quality practices from a technical point of view, which means that the data has to be complete, which means that it should contain all the essential elements that are required to perform that particular task. It should be unique. There shouldn't be duplications because there will be wrong attribution. It should be validated. It should be verified, it should be correct. There are a lot of quality factors. There are 12, 20. You can choose based on your organization. These are the technical aspects at every stage of this pipeline, from the acquisition till the end and beyond. And the second part is data acquisition is an extremely time-consuming, expensive activity, and it's always not easy to share this data across organization. And if you talk to an average data science team in any of your companies, they would be working with toy data sets that they get off the internet. They are perfect. They're not real world, so you can build your models, but how are you going to verify these models with real data sets? So what the AI Act also requests, in addition to the data protection requirements, is you need to have this very good data quality in your pipelines. It should reflect the real world. It should not contain biases. It should be technically robust. And still you have to maintain all these. So how are you going to do it is the big question. So one of the approaches that we take is that of synthetic data, which means that you're able to take the real world data sets. Most organizations have issues with the quality of data than the quantity. We all talk about big data. So if you actually look at the real data, it's either scarce for that purpose, or it's very dirty, unbalanced, a number of issues. So how do I improve this? So the first thing is data augmentation. So if I have very little unclear data, can I augment it and make it more complete, take all these technical aspects? And the second one is, how am I going to preserve privacy? Can I have a synthetic data set with differential privacy assurances? That's the second step. And the third step is something we call continuous testing. So I would like to have a scenario, a safe place where I can test what my AI models will be up to, test my risks. I should be able to create scenarios with what ifs. I would like a data set with very biased values and see what happens with the models. So you need to have this safe environment. And so just to give you an idea of what is synthetic data, it is fictitious data developed based on real data. It has the same statistical properties of the real data, but can be used as a proxy for real data for privacy preservation, bias detection, mitigation, and test automation. So that's kind of, I hope I have covered your questions.
Yes, no, that's great. Thank you very much, Shalini. Can we turn back to Andrea at this point and ask about transparency? The requirements of providing sufficient transparency are often raised as a challenge. So how is the requirement of transparency covered in the AI Act? Are the requirements of provision of information in Article 13, particularly the explanation of the characteristics, capabilities, and limitations of the AI, achievable in practice?
Yes, thank you very much. What is achievable in practice? I think we will see over the coming months. But transparency is a term that implicitly or explicitly surfaces in several parts of the proposed AI Act. One is, again, for high-risk applications only, the obligation to keep records and keep the traceability of the whole process that was followed in developing the AI system and deploying the AI system, as well as the information and records about the data that was used, and something that Shalini was referring to train the model in how many different ways and with kind of data sources and what arrangements to potentially debias the data sets and so on and so forth. So this is something that has to be done. It's a sort of a back office type of transparency, if you wish. So keeping the possibility to demonstrate how the process was followed, both in the context of a conformity assessment or in the context of a subsequent investigation, if anything. The second is the more consumer-facing part, which is providing consumers or users of the AI system with the information needed that needed to understand what are the limitations and the capabilities and the intended use of this AI system. Now, this is not very different from many other products that are considered to be dangerous. I mean, sometimes even used as in legal terms when we talk about dangerous activities or products that might potentially generate damage in products liability. So the idea is that when we use a pharmaceutical product, we have the information on what that product is intended to do and how to use it with care, right? Handle it with care, not with fear, but with care at least. So that is the type of information provision that might extend to some form of transparency and explainability on how the overall system works, but also in specific cases, and also in compliance with GDPR in many cases, on how a specific decision was actually reached and what are the main elements that led to a specific decision, because of the right to a meaningful explanation in case of decisions that affect personally identifiable data. Now, these are two very important examples of transparency in the AI Act. There's a third one, which is an ad hoc provision that was introduced for those AI systems that might generate confusion in their users as to the human or non-human nature of their interlocutor, right? And so, as I often say here, what we're going to see is, I call it the revenge captcha, because on the internet for 3 decades now, almost 3 decades now, we've been asked very often to prove or to declare that we are not robots, right? To access specific websites. And in some cases, we even train AI systems in order to prove that by locating the objects in specific pictures, so helping image recognition in the future for specific systems. Now, what's going to happen as a result of the AI Act is that for those systems that might generate this type of confusion, now the robots will have to declare that they are not human, right? So they will need to, the AI system will need to provide sufficient information to the end user and sufficiently clear information so that the user understands that they are interacting with the non-human interface. So that is another element of transparency. Now, how well this will be implemented in practice, what kind of guidance will be produced. Thinking about Naeem's speech before, and on the need for clarity and guidance, and also the impossibility theorem that Shalini was illustrating before on what's the perfect data set. I think most of this will have to be subject to the work of very skilled AI board or agency, because those things cannot be fully specified in the text of the law. They have to be in the living provisions that will be specified on a day-by-day basis by a group of experts and by the policymakers that those experts will advise.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I'll hand over to Simon now.
Thanks, Gwen. I think, Andrea, thanks for that. And I think that's a really neat sort of segue as we go in. So I think we've heard already about some of the sort of challenges around how the legislation is going to apply, some of these challenges around the degree of guidance. But what I want to move the conversation on to now is in the context of some of these sort of gaps and sort of the moving goalposts, as I said, around legislation, how strategy can be deployed, in order to allow organizations to start to manage some of these risks and to provide some sort of framework for which organizations can deploy this very powerful technology. So I'd just like to start with quite a basic question, and we touched on some of the points already, and Shalini, if it's okay, I'll come to you first, but why bother with the strategy? Why not just get straight into a risk assessment for particular projects? Why look at it at a slightly sort of higher level for organizations?
No, absolutely, Simon. Because we need a strategy, because we need to have the right expectations about AI. What are we going to achieve with AI in our organizations? That's fundamental to start with. So when you have that objective, then you can mobilize the right stakeholders who are going to work towards implementing that objective. And you have many levels in that. You have the technology level, which is very important. We talked about data pipelines, then you have model pipelines. So you need to, connect that with your policy and governance structures as well. So those two need to talk to each other. So, and it has to be experimental, iterative, always iterative, because try small, start with testing, and get your feedback from your business unit. Because why are you? Of course, you're a business, so you want to understand how is it going to impact my future part of it could be innovation, obviously, long term, but can I already implement it in our business practices, small pilots, and then scale it up? So it should be iterative, it should be collaborative. You should have a buy-in from all your different departments, and then you have to make it scalable. And the most important, like we talked about, skills are very important, not just technical skills. Obviously, technical skills are important, but also this idea that AI will solve everything. So we have two camps. One is it's going to solve everything. One says it's going to doom us all. There should be something in between. So the right expectations, skills, and collaborations, and a comprehensive picture is extremely important.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. I think that importance of the various stakeholders and the skill sets, this is not just boxed away in the technology. There are much wider sort of issues that we're sort of talking about here. Naeem, if I can come to you sort of on the same theme about the importance of the AI, of an AI overall strategy. I don't know if there's anything you can share from your work in the London Stock Exchange about how you've been approaching it, or the way in which you've been coming at it that can help our audience understand the importance here.
Yeah, I think the most useful thing to say is that it really depends on the organization's approach to risk management, and how does AI impact how it looks at various risks. So, for example, if the HR department is looking at AI software to help with recruitment, how does that change the way that they use their old ways of candidate screening, selection, interviewing, promotion, etc. So you really need to sort of start with what is the current state, and then where are these new uses being looked at and addressed against the existing risk assessment methodologies. Then I think also it depends on the maturity level of the organization to be able to incorporate this. Can it absorb it readily? And then finally, what new expertise is required in order to be able to competently look at this, and to say against the organization's risk appetite and its ability to control the potential risks, and the acceptance of any residual risk because it can't be mitigated. So when you start to use a third party's AI, and then you are incorporating it, there's a change, and through that, trying to use another word, but as you go through the production process, where does the responsibility then shift, and so I think there needs to be a starting point of where the organization's at, how it's able to sort of assess it, and that's why it's quite good to sort of look at it from whoever is managing risk, whether that is a group of functions that come together and they are quote unquote the kind of risk management team, or is there a dedicated function for that? And I think the main thing is that this is new, so therefore how well are we able to sort of address the new with the existing skills?
Yeah, no, I think that's really an important point. I think there's a lot of in the market, we are seeing sort of that fear of the new and having to reinvent the wheel, or actually, as I think you've just quite neatly outlined, there's a lot of frameworks that organizations have, or skill sets and risk control that can equally be deployed. So I think that's really, really valuable. Andrea, coming to you, I guess same point, your thoughts on the benefit of a strategy. I'm interested particularly, thoughts maybe on, how values or individual organizations' values may be reflected in that process, as we know that that's so important to many of our clients and many organizations.
I mean, the most important value that a strategy has for a company is not only to reflect in the use of technologies the key values and the key mission of that the company has given itself, but it's also a reflection of the fact that using AI and deploying AI, especially if it's high-risk AI that requires internal assessments, is a decision of the company, and it's something that requires a rather collegial approach inside a business. Meaning that, as we discovered also when we were piloting the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, companies were telling us this is not something that one person can reply to. It's even more than a data protection impact assessment. So we need the DPO, we need the chief legal officer, we need the CTO, we need the number of people that work on specific lines of business in order to be able to fully respond to the many questions that emerge once you start asking yourself the question, how do I deploy AI? And this specific AI for this specific use case. So that is very important. Then the values and the principles that a company tries to translate into concrete operations on a daily basis might result in different approaches to the technology itself, whether to use only explainable AI, whether to refrain from using too energy-consuming AI, or whether to refraining from using AI in specific situations where there's a minimal risk of discrimination. I mean, it depends on the risk aversion and risk attitude of the company itself as a culture. So many of these things might change on a company-by-company basis.
Thanks, Andrea. That's really interesting. Just move us on a little bit. I am conscious I want to allow a little bit of time for some questions at the end, as I know we've got some coming through, and I did promise our audience that we would do. But what I'd just like to touch on is sort of the difficulty, knotty issues that you'd expect perhaps customers to, or sorry, clients and organizations to have to deal with in developing a strategy. As we sort of seen from the survey, a number of our audience are either going through that process or haven't even started yet. If there was maybe one particular issue that you'd highlight to our audience now to say, start thinking about this now, or be aware this is coming, going to be potentially quite a tricky issue, what would you sort of consider? And Andrea, if it's okay, I'll come back to you first. I'm sorry, I think you're still on mute, Andrea.
Yeah, no, you want to know whether there's any further development that might create specific problems in the application of the AI Act, or?
Yeah, well, just in managing or sort of developing a value strategy for an organization, what are some of the really difficult bits that within an organization you can really wrestle with?
Yeah, it's internal coordination, breaking the silos. That is the most important issue, but also how do you relate to a series of legal provisions that are shifting sands. So at the moment, we don't know what the final text of the AI Act will be. When the final text of the AI Act will be available, we still will not know exactly how the AI Act will be implemented. And as the AI Act will start being implemented by regulatory agencies, the AI subject matter will change quickly. So it's very important to ensure that there are mechanisms to spread enough regulatory certainty to businesses. So it's both an internal challenge and an external challenge. Regulators can try to sort of cater for the external challenge. Businesses will have to be more agile internally to be able that they solve the internal one.
So having those frameworks, having that open dialogue, having that engagement, and sort of, as you say, agility, important. Shalini, same sort of question to you. What are some of the knotty challenges? I don't know if there's anything particularly around the AI technology that maybe to highlight.
Absolutely. Just continuing with what Andrea was just talking about, the values of a company, right? So how do you measure them that you're actually, implementing those values? For some of it, you can. If it's energy consuming AI, you can see that we have reduced the computational time by X%. But how do you measure fairness and bias effectively? That's one of the big issues and tricky issues that companies need to think about. So what does fairness mean for me as a company? How am I going to implement that? And are the measures that I'm going to, because there are a lot of metrics that you can use to measure fairness, but is that enough, or is that actually representing the reality? That's a very tricky aspect that it's not easy to solve.
Some of these challenges do remain. And Naeem, what about your experience as well in developing a bit of a risk management tool? Were there any particular really difficult, head-scratching issues that you were dealing with?
Yeah, I think the starting point is that the legislation has obviously focused everyone's mind, but at the same time it's not finalized. So what is the requirement? If you say you understand what GDPR is, then you can solve for it. It's not clear exactly what we're solving for. We can anticipate where we think, but unless your use case falls directly within the high risk, you don't know whether or not you really need to act today. So if you haven't got a clear-cut, obvious use case, what is the impetus to act today? Then to mobilize, gather support, get leadership buy-in from a top down, then go from bottom up and trying to sort of discover the right sort of foundations. So I think it's really back to when you have a clear new law, then you can then start solving for it. But until it's there, you're trying to move a lot of pieces together and gather support, which makes it a little harder. So maybe when this thing is published and it's sort of really clear how it affects your organization, then you'll be able to sort of move forward. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think the other thing I guess is to mention is it is hard sometimes in a large organization to discover all your use cases, because up until now people have been in an experimental mode, and maybe there are a lot of things that have been introduced, but is that really visible? So I think that discovery process sometimes can be harder in a larger, maybe global organization where there might be some regional accountability.
Yeah, no, I think that's really valid. I was going to come on to make that point. You're right. There's obviously some degree or a certain degree of uncertainty here, but a lot of proprietary work, sort of from an audit perspective, awareness perspective, in terms of how that technology is being used to start to inform some of these decisions, given the clear direction of travel that we have, is, I think, very valuable activity, very valuable time. Now, I'm conscious we're nearly out of time, so I will just quickly turn to the Q&A, and I see we've had a few back and forth in the chat already, which is great. So I'll not pick up on those that in the chat. I think it's been some really helpful kind of input from Andrea and Kwan on that. There's a question from Philip Wolf that I think is really interesting that I'll sort of see which of our panelists would want to deal with. But effectively, it's this idea of, again, developing an AI strategy, but given the multiple use cases that could be deployed within an organization, is there an approach of sort of clustering a strategy in some way and actually adopting slightly different flavors of a strategy, perhaps, within an organization or within different ways? I don't know if there's anyone has any particular sort of thoughts on that. Andrea, if it's okay, I might come to you. You indicated a positive ability to answer.
Some sparse thoughts there. Well, from what I've seen and the few examples that I've seen of trying to audit internally an AI system or trying to assess risks related to AI systems with respect to a possible future policy framework, both in the context of, let's say, the US NIST and risk management framework, or the EU emerging conformity assessment framework. I mean, most of the measures that have to be adopted are at once are partly technical and partly organizational. So there is a part in sort of restructuring, re-engineering processes that is something that is very common to an organization that could be taken as the common approach of a business to AI. And then obviously the technical measures and the mitigating measures in case there is some risk change depending on the use case. But there are some fixed costs, if you wish, in adapting to a strategy like this. And these are very, very important. The other thing that I wanted to say is that many companies, and this is perhaps useful for the people connected, I would say many corporations, apart from the IT companies, many of them will actually purchase AI or pre-trained AI systems. So they will be in the position of being providers under the AI Act, but only deployers of AI as opposed to initial developers of AI. So it will be very important that they receive from those that develop AI systems and sell AI systems to them enough instructions and information for them to undergo the internal conformity assessments or the third-party conformity assessment that will be needed. And so this requires some organizational changes and adaptation, but a lot of the technical information should at least partly come from suppliers, let's say, of AI systems.
Yeah, no, very valid. Just one other really interesting question, and Shalini, I'd love to get your sort of view on this.
Okay.
Anonymous attendee asking about whether actually the focus of non-personal data should be regulation within AI that should be removed. Should this only be trying to regulate from a personal data perspective? I guess the question is there other challenges or risks that could arise just from use of data generally within AI that would justify the regulation of non-personal data?
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I think the recent Data Act might be related, because they also talk about sensor data used in AI algorithms. So yes, of course, I think even non-personal data will be very much impacted because that also relates to, again, I'm a data-centric AI person. So obviously, how are you going to manage your data sets? So they have to be immediately available, timely, whether it's personal or non-personal. I don't differentiate in terms of technical robustness about the availability of such information. So absolutely, yes.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I think there are risks that can arise from some of those issues that have arisen that sort of drive that sort of regulation. Now, I'm conscious we're 1 minute over, so I will draw us to a close there. I wanted to thank Shalini, Naeem, Andrea, so much for your time and your effort. That's been really, really interesting. Kwan, thank you so much as usual for your fantastic input as well. And if I could just bring up the final slide, actually, just to quickly trail again our third in our webinar, and jump that up. Coming up, jump through to that. We're coming up in a few weeks' time on the 26th of April, looking at AI preparedness in a little bit more detail. You should all be receiving invites and documents or details will be available shortly. But again, once again, thanks very much to Shalini, to Andrea, and to Naeem. Really appreciate your time, and thanks everyone for joining.
Pleasure.
Thank you.